So here we go. Why do scuba divers fall backwards out of the boat? Because if they fell forwards, they'd still be in the boat.
I'm going to give you an 11 on that. That's pretty good.
All right, thank you so much.